Hello everyone! The 4th week of the 5.0 beta is upon us, and typically, these weeks have the final changes before the new characters are officially released. Usually, however, there are either minor changes or there are no changes. For example, Fowl, who is usually reliable for early kit translations, mentioned that there wouldn't be any kit changes made to Mualani this week. Well, it turns out that Mualani received the most amount of changes this week. Surprise surprise, leakers are sometimes wrong. And after week of nerfs throughout the betas, Mualani finally received a buff to her overall kit. So I wanted to quickly discuss the buffs to Mualani as well as the other various changes made that impact the characters coming in 5.0. The main contributor to Mualani's buff this week comes from her elemental burst. At talent level 10, the HP multiplier is being increased from 84.1% to 105.2%. This may not look like much, but because it is an HP scaling multiplier, the increase is pretty nice for her. A 105% HP multiplier on the burst is a pretty solid nuke of damage for Mualani. And remember that Mualani only attacks a limited number of times, so buffing the burst, which serves as one of her few damage instances, does make a small difference. Unfortunately, in many rotations, you won't be consistently vaping the burst, but still an unreacted 105% HP scaling damage burst is still a solid amount of damage. From what I've seen from theory crafters calculating Mualani's damage after this buff, this change buffed Mualani by about 2%. Honestly, in the grand scheme of things, 2% isn't too significant of a number, but when considering the multiple nerfs that Mualani received these past few weeks, it's nice that Mualani finally received something definitively positive in this beta. And fortunately, even after all the nerfs, she still looks like a pretty strong unit. Mualani also received various other changes that don't really change her team damage specifically, but target her overall quality of life. First, her skill. The interval in which you can use an enhanced normal attack has been increased from 1.6 seconds to 1.8 seconds. This sounds like a nerf, but in the majority of cases, this doesn't really do anything. The main limiting factor for Mualani's attacks were never this Sharky's Bite cooldown that is stated on the skill, but how fast she was able to gain stacks by surfing on enemies. Because you're surfing on enemies, you're just waiting for stacks to accumulate before using her enhanced attack. The only scenario where this change may make Mualani worse is in AoE scenarios where enemies are already grouped and Mualani is constantly able to surf on those enemies, allowing her to quickly gain stacks to use as many 3-stack shark bites as possible. However, these scenarios are uncommon and unrealistic in my opinion, so this change isn't too impactful. Next, her A1 passive. Originally, whenever Mualani used a Sharky Surging Bite, which is her 3-stack enhanced normal attack, she would spawn a floater or puffer on the field which would then return to Mualani. After she picks it up, Mualani would gain additional Nightsoul points, extending her uptime. Previously, Mualani could only spawn 1 puffer per skill usage and the puffer would give 35 Nightsoul points. Now, she can spawn 2 puffers per skill and each puffer gives 20 Nightsoul points, so a total of 40 Nightsoul points. This extra 5 Nightsoul points won't make a big difference in terms of changing her optimal combos. The most recent combo I've described that theory crafters were using to calculate her damage was 1 1-stack enhanced normal and 3 full-stack enhanced normals, otherwise known as 1 and 1 and 3 and 3s. However, this extra 5 Nightsoul points will allow players to more easily achieve this optimal combo. In addition, these extra points will allow more wiggle room for players to fit in their attacks when, for example, enemies are a bit farther away. So a nice quality of life update for Mualani. Next, her A4 passive. Unfortunately, this was technically nerfed for patch 5.0. 1 stack of Nightsoul burst, which Mualani herself can activate, now only boosts the damage of her elemental burst by 15% instead of 20%. But if you have 3 stacks of Nightsoul burst, Mualani's elemental burst will now do 45% additional damage instead of 40%. This change isn't too relevant in terms of her overall damage, and I think the only reason that HOYOverse made this change is to incentivize people to pull for more natlan characters to use with Mualani, as you'll need other natlan units on her team to get the higher damage increases to her elemental burst. Finally, some slight constellation changes. First, Mualani C1 was buffed. The extra damage to her first 3-stack shark bite was increased from 60% to 66%. Next, her C2 was changed due to the puffer change of her A1 passive. Previously, the puffer would give Mualani an additional 25 Nightsoul points if you had her C2. Now, after getting back the 2 puffers, Mualani only gets an additional 12 Nightsoul points. This sounds like a nerf because there's 13 less Nightsoul points, but because the first part of her C2 says that each puffer that Mualani gains gives a stack of wave momentum, C2 now gives an extra stack because Mualani spawns 2 puffers with her updated A1 passive. This balances out the loss of additional Night Soul points since you're normally using those Night Soul points for Mualani to surf on enemies to gain stacks. TLDR, the C2 which is updated to match the changes made to her A1 passive. Its main benefit of allowing for more fully stacked sharp bites is still the same. And lastly, C4 was changed because of the A1 passive update. Technically, this constellation now gives 1 extra energy, so it's technically also a buff. The final quality of life buff to Mualani was made to her signature weapon. The cooldown of activation was increased from 12 seconds to 15 seconds, but it doesn't really matter because you weren't using Mualani's skill every 12 seconds anyway. The main benefit is that the duration of the buffs granted from this signature weapon has been increased. Originally, it was 10 seconds, now it's 14 seconds. I don't think this buff does too much for Mualani at C0, as each time Mualani uses her skill and performs her attacks at C0, she typically takes around 9 seconds of uptime. However, this buff does help Mualani at C2 and up, since she has increased field time with her C2. Thus, with only 10 seconds, the buff would have fell off with the previous iteration of the signature weapon. With the increase to 14 seconds, your buff won't fall off. And those were all the changes to Mualani. As for the other characters releasing in 5.0, Kinich actually received his first nerf in this beta cycle. When his burst is used while he's in Night Soul's Blessing, aka after using his skill, the enhanced state is only increased by 1.7 seconds now. Previously, it was 2 seconds. That's the nerf, and if you haven't realized already, this change doesn't really do anything, so it is as if Kinich didn't really get any changes this week. As for Kachina, she actually didn't get any changes to her kit this week. Honestly, not too surprising since she's a 4-star character, and usually HOYOverse doesn't really change 4-star characters that much during betas, especially compared to 5-star characters. The final updates I want to cover are on the 2 new natlan artifact sets releasing in 5.0. First, the DPS set, Obsidian Codex, is getting a buff. In order to proc the 4-piece set to gain the 40% crit rate, the character using the set, which is going to be a natlan character, only needs to spend 1 Night Soul point instead of 10. This doesn't really change anything for Kinich and Mualani specifically, since they will spend at least 10 Night Soul points before doing most of their damage, so their damage will get buffed at the correct time. I think this change mainly allows HOYOverse to be more flexible in their character design for future natlan DPS characters, because with the previous necessity of spending 10 Night Soul points to activate this 4-piece artifact set, all future DPS characters must be designed around spending 10 or more Night Soul points near the beginning in order for them to utilize this artifact set well. But by changing it to 1, future character design can be more flexible. For instance, a character can go into Night Soul and their first attack can spend, let's just say, 5 Night Soul points, and it will be enough to activate the 4-piece set. And lastly, the support set, Scroll of the Embered City's Hero. The numbers on the set were not changed. It still can give 40% damage bonus to a team, which is still pretty insane. However, they removed the physical damage bonus given from the support set. Honestly, this is somewhat logical because the 4-piece requires you to trigger elemental reactions, and the damage bonus provided is for the elements involved in that reaction. And since physical doesn't react, it didn't really make sense that physical damage bonus was also buffed. Unfortunately, for all you physical enjoyers, this set will not buff your carries, and you're going to have to wait again and hope that HOYOverse decides to add anything to buff the physical niche. And those were all the important and relevant character changes made for this week's 5.0 beta update. As I stated before, this week usually contains the last changes. However, additional changes can happen as it has happened before, although it is usually not the norm. Fortunately, I think all of the upcoming 5-point characters are pretty strong. Kachina is a fine support that can abuse the new natlan support set, and both Kinich and Mualani are looking to be very solid DPSs with some strong teams. I'm quite excited for the release of natlan coming very soon, and I can't wait to potentially try out these new characters. If you thought this update and analysis video was helpful, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a ton. As always, if you have any thoughts and questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll try to answer them. And if you have any specific questions or want to chat more about beta updates, join the Discord. I have a Discord server, it's new. Feel free to join and chill. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.